everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon.
Okay.
I'm Maureen Conway. I'm Vice President at the Aspen Institute, Executive Director of our Economic Opportunities Program. Delighted to welcome you to our 14th conversation, actually, in our Working in America series, in which we look at ideas for improving the lives and livelihoods of working Americans. I just have a couple of quick announcements to make before we start. One is please do silence your phone, but please do tweet. Our hashtag is TalkWithJobs. And I do want to thank our funders who make this work all possible. We are supported by the Ford Foundation, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, the F.B. Heron Foundation, and the Surdna Foundation. And I'm delighted today that we have our Aspen Institute President, Walter Isaacson, to lead us off. The Working in America series is part of a larger set of conversations we have at the Institute about the economy and how to improve economic opportunity and address the challenge of inequality. And so Walter will go ahead and start us off. Thank you, Walter.
Maureen, thanks for all you do. It's amazing. Maureen is somebody who not only leads with a great deal of intellectual capability and honesty, but also with a good moral heart. And that's what we hope to do at the Institute, is sort of have leadership based on values. We also like to bring people together of different backgrounds and different perspectives. In fact, if you just go out in the lobby, you're going to see, I think, Bill Clinton and Native American youth, everybody's hanging around here. But it's a good way to bring people together and find out. I mean, as Steve Jobs once said, that if you make a big atrium and people have to wander through it, then ideas and creativity happen. So I hope you'll become part of the Aspen Institute in its larger formation, not just come to these type of things. The 1099 economy, I talked to Senator Warner. He sort of broached this idea maybe 6-7 months ago when we were talking about it. And I realized that there's enormous upsides and enormous new challenges we face in an economy that's based on gig and sharing and not doing what I did when I got out of college and was in New Orleans and got hired by Time Incorporated and spent 32 years on the same pension plan with the same telephone extension, with the same health benefits and everything else, and just had a whole career with one corporation. My daughter, among other people I know, is age 25 and is juggling 4 jobs and really loving a portfolio. We have to both be able to enable people to do things like that, but also have the social contract that makes sure all of that is fair. We've had a lot of people discussing at the Institute in our various programs the causes of economic opportunity, poverty. Jamie Miller is back there sitting on the thing, is helping coordinate some of the big public gatherings we're going to do on the economic opportunity programs. And today we're discussing the 1099 economy. I hope we can also discuss many names we can have for it. Kind of like the gig economy, but that sounds like a fisherman off the coast of the Gulf Coast trying to gig fish or something. But as we get a more flexible economy, what is the social contract we need to have as a nation, and what do we need our corporations to do? It ties in with another idea that Senator Warner is talking about, is what do we need our corporations to do? Something that Maureen, Jamie, and many others have worked on here. The Senator is a true leader on this issue. He's probably the most outspoken federal policy maker thinking through the sharing economy and gig economy, bringing national attention to the need for more data and an open-minded approach to this issue. I would hate to see this issue, which is something, as I said, is an enormous opportunity and a bit of a challenge for America, to become polarized, where people immediately do what they do when they turn on cable news now. You say, okay, here's a new idea. Let me jump to one extreme or the other on this issue. This is an issue as I look at, just spent 2 weeks down in New Orleans for the 10th anniversary of Katrina. And the gig and sharing economy is both good and challenging. And I hope everybody can avoid saying, let me take a stance on one extreme or these others. That's why Senator Warner is our guru here, is he's somebody who in all issues has tried to say, let me think it through carefully, instead of being somebody who immediately leaps to an ideological conclusion. He was reelected to a second term this past November. He's also been the governor of Virginia, where he championed innovative workforce development policies and career training pathways. But the other thing that's important to know about him is that he spent 20 years in the technology industry, a business leader, cell phones, telecommunications, survived knowing Steve Case and many others, and so did I in those days. And he also was the first in his family to graduate from college, so he understands the importance of education and innovation. He has personal experience with why it's critical for us to improve business and government policies, and to ensure, this is the important thing, that working Americans can build and sustain healthy economic livelihoods. So let me turn it over to Senator Warner.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Walter. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Maureen, for all the great work you've done on getting this together. And sometimes being a senator, you actually have job envy of other folks. One of the people, wouldn't you love to have Walter's job? You get to convene really interesting people across diverse backgrounds. You've got this wonderful, Aspen Institute platform, and then in your spare time, you get to go to extraordinary places like Italy and write really cool books about phenomenal individuals. So,
And spend the summer in Aspen.
And spend the summer in Aspen. So, a pretty good gig, if I may say so. It is kind of wild though. We think about this gig on demand, sharing, 1099. It's cool to be talking about an issue that doesn't even have a title yet. And that is both a challenge and an opportunity. As Walter mentioned, my background is, I actually can still claim I was in business longer than in politics. And while I managed to do pretty well with cell phones, Maureen, it breaks my heart when you say silence your cell phones. As a co-founder of Nextel, I love to hear those sounds go off. But I also failed miserably at a couple businesses. So I was, in the gig economy. Before it was the gig economy, I was called unemployed, but it has been, or freelance, And why I think this issue is so important is, and over the last 9 months to a year, have been really starting to drill down on it. And again, good news, bad news, virtually nobody else in Washington is talking about it yet. And to echo what Walter has said, we've got to make sure that this doesn't get captured in the partisan divide. Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. I don't believe it's on those distinctions. It really is much more future past. And it's how we ought to be thinking about it. And it will mean, I say this to my Democratic colleague friends, the idea that we're going to fix this by simply reclassifying everybody with 20th century definitions isn't going to work. So we do have to think about this more future past. We do need to think about this in terms of some of the policy questions before it gets captured as we go into a presidential contest as with partisan issues. And so I think the timeliness of this is really important. What we also need to know is how big is this phenomenon? I've seen the Journal come out and saying it's not really much at all. I've heard McKinsey say, and actually GAO's put out a study that said it's somewhere between 5 and 47 million. McKinsey says it's literally 53 million fit into the contingent workforce, and that is a much potentially broader category. But if up to a third of the American workforce is now engaged in some form or another of a independent contractor, contingent worker, gig economy, 1099 economy, this is something big that's happened. And it's being driven in many ways by the millennials. The millennials now, I think, Walter, you and I are still both baby boomers, pretty much. We're yesterday's news. The millennials have bumped the baby boomers off the stage. They're the largest age cohort. They, within 10 years, are going to be more than close to 60% of the American workforce, 75% of the overall world workforce. And they are so, Walter was mentioning his daughter, I've got 3 daughters a little bit younger, but they're kind of all thinking less about where they're going to work in a job and more about what they're going to work on. And I would also add one of the people that I've gotten to know a little bit, going to be out in the Bay Area in a couple of weeks, Brian Chesky at Airbnb, who's the CEO there. Airbnb, by the way, which has got more rooms than Marriott and a larger market cap than Marriott. Has and he very much fits in this category, but he has a kind of a mind-bending thought that amongst the millennials, their idea of success is not own a home, 2 cars, and maybe if you do really well, get a little house on the lake. Their idea is sharing these items and collecting experiences, protecting their information, and having a whole different approach to what is viewed as success. If that proves to be the case, then a legal and kind of political structure built around ownership really may need to be be rethought a little bit. And this beginnings of the gig on-demand 1099 economy may be the forebearers of what to come. There's a lot of discussion. Is this driven by economic necessity? Is it driven by choice? One of the things that I've found as I travel around and have had a series of kind of roundtables around Virginia and elsewhere is that, and this is not scientific, this may be by self-selection, that the overwhelming number of people that I'm talking to really love this lifestyle. And it's taken, even say in Roanoke, Virginia, where some of the folks I was talking with were older and have been displaced workers, it took pushing, at 10% additional income, none of them will go back to a traditional job. At 20%, they wouldn't. It took getting to 30 or 35% before folks in this flexible economy are willing to think about, I will go back to a traditional approach that Walter and I had growing up, that 9 to 5, in a sense that we've all grown up with. The challenge with this economy, as we all know, and I'm going to try to do this very quickly so we can get to the conversation, is that even if you're doing really well, you're operating without any net below you. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when the stuff hits the fan, in the age of digital, you can never say anything other than stuff. But when the stuff hits the fan, as it always does, what happens if you can go from here down to here? You could potentially be back on the government dime with nothing to catch you in between. Because there's not unemployment, there's not workman's comp, there's not disability, there's not retirement. So how do we think about this in a way that maintains the freedom and flexibility and innovation, but still realizes there needs to be some level of social contract? And again, Maureen's coming out cell phones. The remarkable thing is what has really allowed this phenomenon and these platforms to take place really is the intersection of two totally separate ideas, cell phones and GPS technology. Because part of this is the ability to monetize your time, your car, your apartment in a way that was never possible beforehand. So what are the policy questions I think we ought to look at? One is, and this will be, I know what we'll talk about here, the nature of the whole employee-employer relationship. I don't believe the 20th century definitions of you're either an employee or an independent contractor are going to be enough. And there are other nations, Canada, Germany, lots of folks in the EU are starting to think about third levels of definition and potentially more. Part of this phenomenon is taking place, frankly, love it or hate it, around Obamacare, because the ability to have health care that's not tied to your employment really frees up a lot of the ability to be in this on-demand economy. So as we look at unemployment, workman's comp, disability, traditional state-run social insurance programs, should we look at the healthcare exchange model? Should they be opt-in or opt-out? Does it have to be government-run? Could it be private sector-run? Can we take some of the old ideas? One of the ideas I'm very interested in is the hour bank. Think about the building trades unions. If you were a carpenter in the 50s, you might have worked for 10 different contractors. Some might have been good, some may not have been good, but on every one of those you had a portable benefit, and both you and the employer paid in a little bit, and it was managed by an independent third party, not by the government, by, in that case, the union. So is there going to be a third-party social benefit that might be administered? We've got to also make sure, and what I've found kind of on the second issue is you don't want to squash the innovation. But as I talk particularly to people working in the on-demand economy and CEOs, they do realize there needs to be some policy prescriptions. We don't want to come in heavy-handedly, but we also don't want to default to 100 different litigation cases all across the country. So I do think this is an area where there is this moment, if we can get it before it gets polarized, where we can be ahead on the policy area in collaboration with the people who are doing the innovation, in collaboration with the people who are working in this economy. And they do need these things. I was with a bunch of Etsy makers the other day, and they all love it, but they were really afraid. A couple of them were jewelry makers. They said, if I hurt my hand, I've got nothing. So this is an issue that cries out for a solution. Third is that, on a broader basis, and this is a little tangential, but I think we have to realize the federal government needs to be a heck of a lot more nimble. We don't have great data, and we need to get BLS to do one of those supplemental surveys to try to look at how really big this economy is, what are more of its characteristics. We've got to look on an ancillary basis about things like making sure if we're going to have this innovation-driven gig economy all across the country, we've got to make sure we've got broadband deployment. There's lots of areas around Virginia in particular where people would love to do this. In rural communities that have been displaced with furniture and textiles and others, they want to try this, but they got to have broadband. We've got to make sure we do a better job. Many of the folks that I see in the so-called gig economy that are millennials are actually entrepreneurs as well. So how do we consolidate and think better about the federal programs, which are a complete mishmash about supporting of entrepreneurs? And then another notion that drives folks into this gig or on-demand economy, this is partially by the economic necessity, is the crushing amount of $1.2 trillion of student debt. So while not directly the subjects, these are ancillary issues that we have to take on. And finally, what I hope we would recognize is this is not something we could, government could squash it by having policies that don't make sense. But this kind of innovation is not going to disappear, not only from America, but around the world. We ought to support it, encourage it, but we also need to recognize there does need to be that safety net. And the report from the front is the vast majority of both on the business side and on the working side want to get it right. And what gives me hope, and I'll go sit down, is that the coolest thing about the millennial generation I found, and I say this as the father of 3 of those daughters who may not always be in the cool category, but is that they want to work for and do the right thing. And the idea that we can fashion policies that lean into this 21st century are extraordinarily exciting in a place where, at least on my day job, not always exciting things happen. Thanks a lot and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for that. We are so grateful for your leadership and thoughtfulness on these issues, and I think that perfectly frames the conversation we want to have today. I want to very quickly introduce the rest of our panelists because we have fabulous panelists. You have their materials and bios on your chairs, so I will just put names to faces. So next to Senator Warner, we have Saket Soni, Director, National Guest Worker Alliance in New Orleans Worker Center for Racial Justice. Next to Saket is Natalie Foster, Fellow at the Institute for a Future and co-founder of Peers. Next to Natalie, we have Jared Bernstein, who is now Senior Fellow, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and the Board Chair of the National Employment Law Project. And next to Jared, we have David Williams, Chief Tax Officer for Intuit. And we're very grateful to Yuki Noguchi for being willing to moderate this event and corral everybody and keep us all on track. So I will turn it over to Yuki. Thank you.
Thanks for the introductions, and thank you all for being here. Obviously, this is a very fascinating subject, and I probably can't do a good job of topping Senator Warner and his introduction into the issues. But obviously, it's something that we see playing out in so many aspects of our lives, right? You have online, you have TaskRabbit and Elance and all these sort of online sources of gig economy or freelance economy and work. To get here, I took an Uber, and I'm sure that most of you are familiar with Uber and Lyft and those kinds of things. But also, I think in this city, we're also seeing a lot of discussion about what might be called the fissured economy. People who are working under contract. And I think, as Senator Warner mentioned, a lot of people are trying to figure out what the employer-employee relationship now looks like in a freelance or gig or contractor economy. What are the responsibilities that employers have to this loosely attached workforce? And I want to just go through, because the terms are really confusing. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about terms. When we talk about the 1099 workforce, I think we're talking about anyone who files a 1099 form with the IRS, either incorporated or as an individual. This includes independent contractors and consultants and temps, freelancers, and sharing economy workers. It might also include people who have a job during the day but might part-time be driving an Uber or something at night or on the weekend. It might also include entrepreneurs. All of these workers fall under what you might call contingent workers. And contingent workers make up a big minority of the US. We don't exactly know how big. By the broadest definition, this group of contingent and part-time workers might make up as much as 40% of the workforce. That's roughly 55 million people. But the numbers vary. So it can be as low as, say, 10 million people, depending on the definition. I just want to see a show of hands, actually, just out of curiosity, how many people in this room, I don't know if it's representative, but how many people would consider yourselves part of the contingent workforce? Okay, so it looks like about 20, 25. So according to the data, those of you who just raised your hand, that work in these sort of non-standard work arrangements make a little less than people who are employed by an employer, but you're also on average happier, as it turns out. Given all the buzz that we hear about the sharing economy and sort of contractors and so on, it's sort of tempting to think that the overall number of people in this workforce is growing, but the data actually does not suggest that that is a rapidly growing number of people. So I want to actually turn to our panelists because they have much more data and insight than I do about this. We're going to look first at the trends, what the data say about what's driving the economy. We also want to look at the impacts of these trends, or what the impacts are expected to be. And then finally, we'll have a policy discussion, and then we'll move to your Q&A. It's a lot of material, so panelists, if you can keep your answers lively and interesting and punchy, that'd be great.
Readable.
All right. Sure, yes. Without further ado, let's talk about the trends here. And I thought we have Jared Bernstein, who's an economist. Perhaps you could give us some perspective on the trends in the market, what you think is sort of driving this.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Yuki, and for the invitation to my friends at Aspen. Senator Warner, my senator, great comments. I think you just teed up everything, and I thought what I particularly liked in your comments was that you captured the conflict at the heart of this, the two sides of this dynamic. And so I think your question about what's driving it is a good place to start. And I would argue that what we're seeing in what I think of as the on-demand economy, and I'll explain why that's probably my favorite term, in part because calling something the 1099 economy is really boring. It makes you think about a form. I think what we're seeing here is really the collision between a number of forces. On the one hand, and I'd call this kind of on the positive side of the kind of duality that Senator Warner correctly set up, you have technology working, I think, in very positive ways, and you have flexibility, which is something that, as was mentioned, is a very desirable characteristic for many folks. On the other side, and that tends to be where I focus because I'm really concerned about the impact on wages, on living standards, on employment security, on the inadequacy of the safety net, as was mentioned, on the issue of misclassification. I'm very focused on those. I recognize that some of those are old issues that may not map as well into the current economy, but I actually think they do, and they must, and they should. So on the other side, and then I'll stop, is a very significant risk shift that's been ongoing for decades now, where basically the risks of being able to enjoy increasing living standards, the risks of your paycheck being disconnected from productivity, the risks of inadequate bargaining power so that you don't get your fair share of productivity growth. That's been an ongoing process. We see it in the workplace in the shift from defined benefit to defined contribution pensions. We see it in various efforts to privatize. You can see it in the decline in the real minimum wage, at least at the federal level. That risk shift, in many ways, the arm's length employment relationship that's inherent in the on-demand economy can be viewed on this negative side as almost the last step of the ultimate step of the risk shift, where employers are not responsible for the well-being of their employees in ways that have worked for us in the past. Secondly, on the negative side, there's been a very long-term, pervasive, and in some cases pernicious, a drive to hold down labor costs at all costs. Whatever cuts labor costs is what we want to do because we want to boost profits and workers having more bargaining power. The more that, the lengthier that arm's length relationship is, the less the bargaining power. So holding down labor costs is another problem. And then finally, there's an atomization of the labor market and the product market. And this atomization is facilitated by technology in ways that remind me more of the guild economy or the piecework economy that existed when, when economies as we know them got their start back in the 15s and 1600s. And I'd like to come back to that more as we go, because again, I think that has positive attributes in terms of the almost boutiquing of individual demands, both on the product side and the labor side, but I also think it has steep costs.
Okay, so David, obviously Intuit collects a lot of data. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what kind of data you do collect as it pertains to this subject, and what does the data show?
Sure. Thanks, Yuki. First of all, I just want to thank you for having us and also for teeing up the issue. One of the things I heard and continue to hear is some confusion around the size of this economy. We've talked about almost 50 million people. Our company is at that intersection where individuals are trying to engage with their jobs, and we've done a preliminary study that suggests if you're just talking about the sharing economy, folks that are in the Uber, TaskRabbit business, it's not as big a number as we think it is. It's probably somewhere around 3 million folks today. Our survey suggests that within 4 or 5 years, it's going to double to almost 8 million. And
are those people coming from employer jobs, or are they coming off the sidelines? Are they part-time?
So interestingly enough, almost 80% of them are doing this as a part-time activity, which suggests that they may have other kinds of opportunities for the safety net that we've been talking about earlier. But we don't know. And so that's why we're conducting a further study to get more detail around the profiles of these folks, how they live, how they work, and what those other jobs look like. And you'll see that coming from us in a couple months.
Mm-hmm. Other than the sharing economy, is there other data on how big the contingent workforce is and
yeah.
whether it's growing?
So I think you know as well as I, GAO has done a massive review of all of the data, and the range, as Senator Warner noted, could be anywhere from 3 to 4 million to 50 million, depending on how one defines what contingent means. And so it's really about definition. I think one of the problems we have that Senator Warner is pushing on is we need better data. We also need better definitions about what we're talking about, because things get mixed up as we talk about them.
Right, okay. And Natalie, your organization, Peers, maybe you could talk briefly about what that does. I mean, you're sort of supporting workers who are self-employed in this economy, and you're concerned about social safety net issues, which we can talk about a little bit later. But what can you tell us about the workers' experience, and what are they telling you about the kind of support that they need?
Yeah, thank you. So we launched Peers about 3 years ago to support people who work in the peer economy. And just to throw out my own definition, since we're all definitionizing, to me, the on-demand economy is not actually just a term for the ill-named sharing economy. It's actually a different thing that's sort of growing out of the sharing economy. To me, the sharing economy is sort of about sharing assets, boats, cars, rooms, bicycles, and what you see growing out of that is an app where I push my button and a meal is delivered to my door. I push a button and laundry shows up on my doorstep, or weed, or whatever the on-demand economy.
Not Colorado,
Fair, but it does exist. There are many of them, and they are funded.
Where's that again? She lives in Oakland.
Yes, exactly.
What's the app?
But this is what's in vogue in Silicon Valley now. And this model is what's very exciting for consumers. I think part of the reason we have this conversation a lot, even though the numbers are still quite small, the on-demand economy is part of a much larger, as the Freelancers Union says, 53 million people who are freelancers in the country. But it's charismatic in that way because everyone interacts with it and then has a story about an Uber driver that they want to tell you. So to that end, I think it's really important that it's finally catalyzing, this conversation. So I'll say, of our members, we see sort of 4 archetypes of people who are doing this work. The first is somebody who's looking for flexibility. So I think of an early Peers member I met who left his retail job where he had no ability to determine his own schedule and started driving on a ride-sharing platform, Lyft. And he was able to make his son's soccer practice at 3 p.m. every day, which was the world to him. And that flexibility is what he traded out for a job that, had very minimal social safety net benefits as well. So one is flexibility. Two is additional income or gig. So this is people who have a full-time job, like my Lyft driver last night, who is a car salesman in Columbia, Maryland, but also drives for Lyft to supplement his income. And we hear a lot of stories about why people are doing that. Some it's to sock away, and some it's because something's happened in their family and there's no recourse for that. A third archetype we hear is people who are in transition. These are people who had a full-time job and lost it. And are moving and want to find another full-time job and are doing this to get by in the meantime. And the fourth that we hear a lot about also are entrepreneurs. So I think of this woman, Maria, who's been cleaning homes for a long time. And she saw that Handy, one of the platforms that connects house cleaners to people who need their homes cleaned, would be a really interesting way for her to get new customers. So she signed up, and she now has a steady flow of customers that come in through Handy. And what she does is builds a relationship with someone and then moves off platform, which we call off platforming. So she's somebody who's building her business using one of these platforms. So the flexibility, the people in transition, the entrepreneurs, and those who are supplementing their income are just four of the different types of things that I think are driving why people are doing this work.
Okay. Saket, maybe you could talk a little bit about, you work a lot with low-wage workers, and I wonder what, do they make up, what is their role in this economy? I mean, do they make up a big part of this gig economy?
They make up
Or
a big,
contractors?
Yeah, they make up a significant part of this economy. Our members are low-wage workers in multiple industries, industries that have long been characterized as contingent and low-wage. Long been characterized as poor quality jobs until workers get together, organize, and lift the quality of work. These workers are in the on-demand economy. They're Amazon warehouse workers in California who package the thing quickly so you can get it in a day. They're on supply chains that deliver to giant retailers. These are workers who are very much part of this economy, whatever name you may give it. I'll say that the priorities of our members in this debate are important, not just because they're low-wage workers, but because we live in an economy where very few of us anymore aren't low-wage workers. So this question that you raised, Senator, about future versus past, or is the debate good versus bad? Look, the debate about whether technology is good or bad has been raging since two cave dwellers sat around saying, fire good, fire bad. And, then they killed an animal. The reality is that we know that markets have created too much inequality and government has not supported enough equality. Markets have driven it one way, governments have not created enough opportunity. And in the middle of that, we have to, I think, come together around this idea that we want to increase equality in the structure and not necessarily debate whether there should be more of the coming structure. I don't think that's a useful debate, not one that's helpful to my members who are, below 5 layers of subcontractors at the bottom of the factory floor, where they're earning literally $1 to $5 an hour. The question shouldn't be, is it happening? The question is, how do we increase equality in it? Now, when we agree that that is the question, then we have to separate out and make some distinctions, and I would just offer two. One is that I completely agree that increasing equality means increasing choices, and that means that some kind of benefits that aren't tied to your employer are very important. The ability to walk away from work, come home to your soccer game, the ability of a Walmart worker to plan ahead, schedule daycare, all of those are very important. And all of those are supported when you can be flexible in an economy where employers want you to be flexible because they need to deliver quickly to customers. So portable benefits answers the question of how workers delink themselves from their employer in that way. The question portable benefits doesn't by itself answer is a broader question of economic choice, because not only is the employment now more flexible, but it's much more intermittent. Our members sometimes go weeks between gigs. They have to A landscaper in my office 2 weeks ago went several weeks before his next shift. And more people are unemployed for longer and longer, and we're seeing the rise of long-term and structural unemployment. So portable benefits that are tagged to days or periods of employment won't solve a problem in which African American and Latino workers in particular have weeks and weeks, sometimes months out of unemployment, at the end of which they lose their contacts, and when they go back to that next job interview, the first question asked is not, tell me about yourself, it's, why haven't you been employed for 28 weeks? There, people have started talking about the idea of a basic income, of a guaranteed income. We can think through that idea, but I do think we're at a moment that pushes us to look for the crossover. There could be an uncommon coalition across multiple views and places in this economy.
Senator Warner, you mentioned, you touched a little bit on the sort of the classification of misclassification of workers issue, and this is something that's part of the broader discussion, about who is really the employer, who's the boss, when it comes to these workers. I mean, you see the Uber class action lawsuit in California. You see actually the NLRB talking about classification workers, contractors. I mean, what is your view on how these workers ought to be classified?
Well, first of all, let's again hit a couple of the, building on what everybody else's points. One, the last time BLS looked at the contingent workforce or the department was 2005. So, we got to have better data, number one. Number two, whether we start as the baseline at 3 million, 8 million, or 53 million, there's no question that even if you take the lowest number, there is no faster growing sector. I remember, David, some of the folks from one of your new product lines, the micro entrepreneur tax line, it's got a huge growth factor. Number three, I do think there is a bit of a sea change, particularly going on amongst millennials, about, and whether again this is choice or economic necessity, that is driven not thinking they're going to work a la Walter for 32 years for the same firm, and then go write great books. But they're not going to have that kind of predictability. Frankly, the same group of millennials who don't think they're going to have Medicare or Social Security because we haven't got our act together at the federal level. I have very little sympathy, and this is a little bit socket, and Jared said, for those enterprises who, for purely short-term bottom line reasons, are taking a workforce that until now has been an employee workforce. You got to wear a uniform, you got to show up on a schedule, and oftentimes I think about subcontractors in the janitorial services, and they have suddenly decided, oh my gosh, if we call you simply independent contractors, we can cut off all your benefits. I mean, that is Jared's comment about pernicious defines kind of the short-termism run rampant. I do think, on the other hand, the idea that someone who, may drive 4 times a month Uber and rents out their apartment 2 weekends a month to Airbnb and makes some stuff for Etsy while she also is trying to start an IT business, classifying that person who's got 4 different revenue streams as a traditional employee doesn't get it. And I just hope that we don't get caught into this, you're either independent contractor or you're employee. That I would feel would squash a lot of the innovation and not deal with how we lean into this in a way that provides that safety net in a forward-thinking way, but allows the good, but also shores up.
I'm curious, what kind of solution, what kind of third way?
Well, listen, let me say, this is on the bleeding edge of policy. Canada actually has got something called a dependent contractor. I think they've had since the 90s. Germany's moving in this area. A lot of the EU. This is not just an America-driven phenomenon. This is a worldwide driven phenomenon. We need, frankly, again, better data. I do think we ought to look at some of these various models, and what I have found, and I've got much more work to do, is that many of these platforms the leadership of these platforms, not all, let me be the first to acknowledge, and I won't call out names yet, but many of these platforms' leadership want to get there in terms of doing the right thing. If you think about, let's take Airbnb, which started with virtually no kind of even minimal insurance for somebody renting out their apartment, has now added $1 million insurance, is thinking about putting together a co-op of folks that would have some level of benefits to come in and clean. We need to give some of these platforms the runway to get there and then try to think about the right incentive system.
Go ahead. Both of you indicated.
Well, I think the most important question right now is how do we create the level of stability that we've created over the last century for workers while maintaining the flexibility that we know people want? I think we should start with the question of outcomes that we want, and then we can figure out how to get there. And it might be that employment is one of the way, a W-2 form is actually the way we need to get there. But right now, I think we should focus on where we want to be. And I, for one, don't believe that we should have to choose between stability and flexibility. I think if 40% of the workforce by 2020 is going to be doing contractor work, and it's not just Uber drivers. It's my dad, who is an independent contractor and he owns his own handyman business in Colorado. He actually looks a lot like an Uber driver right now because he's self-employed and he has no access to the social safety net. So these ideas that are generating energy, thanks in part, I think, to the senator's leadership of portable benefits, I think could start to answer some of those outcomes.
Yeah, I'm curious too, like either Saket or Natalie, are most of these people that you encounter, are they doing it voluntarily? Are they sort of driven to it, or are they sort of drawn to it?
Well, it's a little bit of both. Doing things voluntarily because you have 10 choices is different than doing them if you have 2 choices. And choosing between working or being with your kid is not a fair set of choices. And most of our members and most low-wage workers in America are choosing whether to live with and spend time with their kids or whether to feed them. That's not fair polarization of your day. On the other hand, and I think this is where Natalie is absolutely right, Senator Warner makes a really good point, which is that increasing the supports under someone who can then raise their expectations on how flexible they can be is a game changer. Another game changer is that if you follow the logic all the way, one day income will not be tied to work. And see, we've gotten very used to the way jobs are now. But let's just do a little thought experiment. There was a time when agriculture was automated and we were worried. People were worried about work. But was that a time to defend the old system, which was tenant farming and sharecropping and worse stuff that came before it? We shouldn't defend what's worst about the way we work now in being scared of trying to pave a way to the future. We should work backwards from different outcomes than the ones we have now. We're not trying to return to a gilded age. We're trying to build a new one.
So let me say a few words about how I think we build a new one from the old one, as well as some wonky Washington stuff that the senator might appreciate. So you mentioned the contingent worker survey and how we need more information. Now that's 10 years old. Let me tell you 2 facts. One fact is that I know for a fact BLS wants to do another contingent worker survey. They would very much like to do that, and they're really good at this. They're really good at these kinds of gnarly definitions of collective data. Fact 2, the budgets, not the ones that you support, but the budgets that the majority support, cut BLS funding to the point where they cannot do that survey. Okay, so we can talk all we want about how it would be great to have more data, but you can't have more data and cut BLS's budget at the same time. Secondly, if we want to do the next set of things I'm about to talk about, which are ways in which I believe we need to enforce existing labor standards in the on-demand sharing economy. I don't think this takes us back to the Stone Age. I think it actually is the way to map the old onto the new, as Saket suggested. That actually takes enforcement. And the other place where you see some really damaging cuts, now I'm into gnarly budget weeds, and I'm only going there because this case is so important. The wage and hour division of the Department of Labor is essential to this. And if you actually look at the number of wage and hour inspectors relative to the number of workers and workplaces, that ratio has been decimated by budget cuts, and the current budget further cuts. I'm saying the Republican budget further cuts the number of wage and hour inspectors, and that goes exactly the wrong way. Because I happen to believe there is no inherent dichotomy or negativity or negative correlation between innovation and regulation. I think those two not only can coexist, but must coexist. And if innovation does not work in such a way as to uplift the folks that are represented here by Socket and others, then it's going to be roundly opposed. We're going to have exactly the battle you don't want to have about, sort of old versus new. So the key is to make sure that the labor standards that were established a long time ago but are still valid, overtime, minimum wages, health and safety, workers' compensation, not to mention the social insurance programs that independent contractors have to pay into themselves because their employers don't, Social Security, Medicare, all of that needs to be mapped onto this to this new form of work. The way to do it may be a kind of a third category, as was suggested. It may be more of the kind of construction worker, multi-employer kinds of agreements that we talked about before. There's actually an arcane kind of construct in the code, in the tax code called statutory employment, where employees are where employers must contribute to, say, social insurance, even for their self-contractors numerous places down the line. That may be a solution. But that to me is the way to go.
So I wonder, we've talked about the big issues around the social safety net, and I would suggest that Senator Warner's right. The place where we're seeing the growth and the spike in growth is in the microeconomy. I don't think our institutions will evolve quite as quickly as the growth. So I think that's one. And I think the reality is that we need to look at what are the barriers that the contingent workforce is facing right now. If you are in the sharing economy and you have never run a business, all of a sudden you're a small business, and there is a plethora of rules that you've got to follow to ensure that you're complying with, particularly since I'm a tax guy, all of the tax obligations that you have to meet. You have to keep track of records. All of a sudden, there's this whole bunch of stuff that you may not be prepared for. And if our social infrastructure isn't ready for these folks, I would suggest that there are ways in which our tax infrastructure isn't ready either. And we ought to be thinking about, are there micro ways in which we could improve the lots of folks who are trying to get into this economy so that we're not creating unreasonable barriers just because you don't understand the landscape. And it's part of where we focus, but it's really critical that we look both at the big picture and really what is the day-to-day life of these folks.
I think David
I think we're moving into the policy.
I think David and Jared's points are really interesting. I want to make 2 quick points. One is bigger macro picture, but the regulatory structure that we have, which every business I know complains about, doesn't have to be as burdensome going forward. It can still gather the same information. We can just do it, and we can still have the standards in a much more user-efficient way. So we ought to which is nobody's talking about in town. But you guys are doing into it a little bit. There's a startup little competitor of yours in Richmond called Painless 1099. How do you take the structure of being an entrepreneur or being in the sharing economy in a way that you cut down the friction of adhering to government rules? And we ought to be leaning into that as well. And the other part that I should have mentioned earlier, and again, call me a crazy optimist, but there may be a consumer component of this that, one of the things that one of the groups that Walter has backed is an entity called B Lab and B Corp, which is the notion of a corporate form that would have kind of a good housekeeping seal of approval. There's an effort in a country called conscientious capitalism. There's an effort in the UK called inclusive capitalism. Think about, again, that 80 million plus millennial cohort who I'm making the bet is going to want to buy from and work for and patronize entities that do the right thing. So how we start to put some of that value add next to this is a really interesting opportunity. And part of this may even be driven. I even had an idea that might start it off is, you might have something where a consumer would add that tip gratuity to the Airbnb or Uber or Handy or Etsy, and maybe that's matched by a responsible company that goes into a social insurance fund. I think we ought to be as innovative as the platforms are being. Now, again, and that's easy to do on a platform at Aspen. It's a little harder to do 10 blocks from here where I work. But if we do this in a forward-leaning way, and again, I keep coming back to not letting it get captured into here's the Democratic position on this and here's the Republican position on this. Or we could give folks that kind of uplifting economic opportunity, along with not just making it, I got to feed my kid or see my kid opportunity.
Right.
So I want to move into the policy discussion a little bit, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say the first benefit corporation just went public, which was Etsy, right? A peer-to-peer marketplace. So there's a lot of movement in there. But there's one more important thing to think in the conversation around regulation, and that is the government definitely needs better data. It is crazy to me that we don't know how much 1099 work is happening in 2015. At the same time, I think companies can do a lot to be more transparent with their data, which would allow for new kinds of regulation to start to occur. Nick Grossman at Union Square Venture talks about regulation 2.0. How at any given moment we could tell how much someone is making per hour on one of these platforms. There's ways to do that. So I think that we should make sure that's part of the equation as well as the government statistics.
So we talked a little bit about sort of simplifying tax codes and the infrastructure around being a new small business, kind of a seal of approval for businesses to prove that they have, good support for their employees. I mean, what are some other, I guess this time I'm just going to do a lightning round where you guys can talk a little bit about what you think the policy, any policy ideas that you might have to either solve these problems or make it easier to foster this without creating, the kind of social safety net problems that we're talking about. So David, maybe you could talk a little bit about your, either expand on what you were saying before or.
Well, let me just say, without picking specific policies, one of the things that has bedeviled this country for a long time is how we do worker classification. There's a 20-factor test, which I worked on for my career, and I think it's sort of the thing that will always change but never changes. And it creates incentives or disincentives for employers to do things. And we've heard some of the bad side, but it also makes them reluctant to inform their new shared economy workers about basic things that they could do to help themselves. And I think even just providing clarity around what an Uber or an Airbnb could actually tell their workers, just so they understand and are able to cope themselves in the sharing economy, is something that we ought to be exploring. It's not a big legislative lift, but it is something that might help clarify so that you actually get a safety net of knowledge to the worker who is driving an Uber car trying to figure out, what do I have to do? Can Uber tell him or her basic stuff or not, or does that suddenly put them in jeopardy of a lawsuit? And so I think we ought to be looking at just basic information sharing as a way of empowering these individuals to take control of their financial lives.
I go with two things, one of which is very much David's point. I'd put it only slightly differently. Senator Warner correctly points out that if this becomes a kind of an old school misclassification fight, it won't do anybody any good. And I take that point regarding some of the almost kind of canonical examples of the people you mentioned, someone who does Airbnb once a month or something. The fact is, though, and I know you, I suspect you strongly agree with what I'm about to say, while maintaining the points you do, you're focusing on what I think is probably a relatively small group of the classification problem. There are people who drive trucks in ports on the West Coast who so clearly work for the port. The port tells them their hours. The port tells them what they have to do. They work within the port. These are drayage truckers. For years, they've been classified as independent contractors. And so if something goes wrong with the truck, they have to pay for it. So I would say that there are a non-trivial group of old school on-demand independent contractors who have been misclassified in the pernicious system that we've been talking about. So I would get that right. By the way, I think one way to get that right is to get rid of the safe harbor rule that's part of the IRS, which basically tells an employer, well, if you're misclassifying someone, but you've done it forever, keep going, it's okay. I'm exaggerating slightly, but not much. My second point that I'll be brief is labor standards. If you're an independent contractor, you're typically not covered by labor standards. And again, if we want innovation and regulation to be friends and not enemies, then we have to make sure that independent contractors, members of the sharing economy, are covered by labor standards, whether it's minimum wages, safety and health, contributions to social insurance, and so on.
So one thing I think that's really interesting is what the UK did a couple years ago, and they appointed a freelance czar. His name is David Morris, and his job is to figure out across all government agencies what to do about the fact freelancers, don't have access to the social safety net. Feels like now is our moment to appoint a freelance czar to do just this.
Since all our other czars have done so well.
Maybe we need a new name.
There you go.
You can work on the brand.
Have you effectiveness?
Two is, I will say though, the first thing he's focused on is simplification of the tax code, right? For independent workers. So the second thing that we've talked a lot about is portable benefits. Could we set up what Nick Hanauer and David Rolfe call shared security accounts that are prorated? And if I have to use your example, a store on Etsy and I host on Airbnb and I drive for 5 hours a week on Lyft, each one of those interactions could have a prorated contribution to my retirement account, to my paid time off, to my workers' comp and my unemployment insurance. I think there's a lot of energy building around that, and I think it's something worth exploring.
Are there models around that you can point to? I mean, are those sort of...
Weren't you pointing to...
Well, this is kind of the variation on borrowing the best of what was in the building and trades unions around our banks. It's a 21st century version of an hour bank. And I think people are thinking about these things, whether they've been spun out in entirety. Not to my knowledge.
There actually is an example extant today in that the creation of what's called MyRA. The administration is pushing essentially a Roth retirement account that is completely portable. Individuals will be able to sign up in the near future. Right now, they're pushing it through the employers. And I'm interested, so much of what we're talking about is the employer-based model. And even MyRA is now moving to an individual-based model so that you have some of the flexibility. I'm sure it's not quite as broad as what you're talking about, but we at least are exploring that in the country.
I would say, quick comment, I agree with all of that, but I think the best defined benefit package we have right now is called Social Security, and independent contractors are supposed to contribute to that themselves, and it doesn't always happen, and it's another reason to get this straight.
But could you imagine a system where employers could also contribute to that on a prorated basis for independent contractors? Right. That's I think the spirit of the model.
I think that's a neat idea, but I can also imagine a system where employers who actually employ employees would contribute to Social Security. I like that system.
But one other thing I think is interesting there to note, where energy is starting to coalesce around policy ideas, is what's happened in Seattle. So last week, a city councilor put forward a basic law, that enabling legislation that would allow contract taxi drivers, limo drivers, and Lyft and Uber drivers to organize and collectively bargain with platforms. And so if that moves forward, that would be sort of the first time you see 1099 workers doing that. Now, outside of that, there are examples on something like coworker.org, where people are using technology to organize in the workplace. You have Uber drivers who have started campaigns for a tip jar. Exactly to your point, Senator, we also want a tip jar. Postmates, who are delivery employees in San Francisco, have started a campaign to change this one particular thing on the app that only a Postmate delivery person would know about, but has a huge impact on their take-home pay. So that's starting to happen, and I think is interesting signals for.
And the policy question, Saket?
I'll stay away from pointing to specific policy, but any policy intervention would need to do at least three things. Firstly, as work is becoming fragmented and fissured, workers have to hold someone responsible for their treatment. And at least in the near future, a large number of these workers will not be purely self-employed and doing their own projects. There's going to be enough workers for, warehouse packaging the thing I order from Amazon. They have to hold someone accountable. Secondly, any policy intervention has to, whether it's portable benefits or a basic income account for the fact that intermittent work and income separated from work may be the future. And then we have to get our heads around the fact that just these policy solutions will not solve for the problem of voice in democracy. And I think you make this point, Senator, in your recent piece, which was that work isn't just a source of income; it's also a source of meaning, and it's also the way adults, at least in for the last 80, 100 years, have aggregated their voice to make a change in politics, in policy, in our democracy. As work no longer becomes the place for people to aggregate, what is going to be the next basis for democracy? And that's a question that will require a policy imagination that is more leaning into the future rather than a shadow of the legal regime of the past.
Senator?
Did somebody quote that? So I get that down. Sorry, that's good. A couple of quick points. One, agreeing with Jared on one. My obsession the first 6 years was getting our balance sheet right. Not something that we would all agree on how the methodology. I was the Simpson Bowles. I'm one of the gang members in the Senate. But if we don't get that right, we do two things. One, not only do we cut off all of our investment in BLS and we end up with sequestration, we end up with budgets that are, stupid. But we also end up with, particularly from younger people, a complete lack of faith that there's going to be the social insurance programs that have been government structured. So the idea that you're going to create another government structured insurance policy really doesn't have a lot of credibility amongst a millennial generation that doesn't believe even the existing ones are going to be there. So getting our balance sheet right is absolutely essential. Number two, I think you made some really great points. I do think if we try to look a little on the optimistic side here, though, that, and let me also, first of all, acknowledge, if this was a broader group than a Washington policy think tank group, and it was a broader conversation, we'd have, if we did this down in DuPont Circle, and people kind of came up, we'd have a lot of eye rolling about our highfalutin ideas because, contingent on demand economy, working 3 jobs, that's been called getting by if you're poor in America for the last 50 years. So we have to have a little humility on all this. But, the intermittent nature of work and the ability to monetize that spare time in between your traditional work in other ways really opens up for a whole lot of folks that have only had one avenue that was packing those boxes or cleaning that building, other potential revenue sources that might give them opportunity to expand and grow in ways that were unprecedented. And one of in a separate bucket at some point, how we get capitalism to advance that rather than just government to advance that ought to be a subsequent conversation. And the third piece is that I do, again, trying to sound naively optimistic at this end of the podium, the ability to enhance younger people and millennials to help push this in a more responsible way is a really exciting opportunity. And the ideas of engaging with some of these platforms and rewarding those who get it right. The fact that you set up Peers Inc. was a private, non-state-run way to try to address some of these issues, Joey. So I think, I don't have if I had the policy answer, I would have begged Walter to give me the whole 45 minutes and you would have heard the whole spiel. You just heard me ask the questions. But I would just say there needs to be a real sense of urgency around this because I'll bet you dollars to donuts, if we aren't leaning into this, we're going to have presidential candidates before the end of the year, by next spring, coming out with their 2-point platforms on this that are going to sound very 20th century from either end of the spectrum.
Well, on that note, I think we should maybe do some Q&A. And the way I think we're going to do this is maybe ask 3 questions so that we get, a multiplicity of questions at once. And then, you can either specify or our panelists can answer your questions. So we've got a microphone here. Go ahead. Could you turn it on, please?
That always happens.
It does.
There you go.
I was going to ask you what your response would be if I were to suggest that instead of focusing on the sharing economy, which seems to be a very small part, as opposed to what we used to talk about, the knowledge economy or the ownership economy. And from a policy point of view, maybe we could think about apprenticeships as a way of building more skills for people to share in the knowledge economy, and as well as ESOPs, promote ESOPs as a way to encourage more participation in the ownership.
Okay, another question, maybe on this, from this side, in the front here.
This is rather related to what he just said. We haven't much talked about the idea of community colleges as a way of people beginning to see other employment options. Obama has talked about free 2 years of community college, and also the role of libraries in opening up possibilities to people who haven't even thought of new occupations. They're channeled in certain ways because of what they've heard and where they live. But the world is a big place, and we need to open up people's thinking and things they can do and worlds they can explore. So I'd like some thoughts about the mixture of education and on-demand and contingent work.
Okay.
I have a more basic question based on the Wall Street Journal's July story, which is this real? And, not to be too flip about this, but, I understand that what's been called the fissured workforce is real, that over the last 40 years or so, we have seen corporations move heaven and earth to avoid paying anybody $25,000 a year. Those people get farmed out to frequently fly-by-night subcontractors, which creates an enormous social problem with respect to enforcing labor standards. We know about that, thanks in part to David Weil's book, The Fissured Workplace. What I don't feel I have much understanding of is, do we have an independent contractor problem? Your information sheet here says that we've seen the unincorporated self-employment rate fall from 18.5% to 6.5%. That would appear to suggest that we don't. I'm a little unclear about how the definitions work. I suppose if you, in one highly attenuated sense, you could call me a 1099 worker because I file 1099s for the occasional book review I write, but I'm a salaried worker, and guys like me have been around since time immemorial. The real question, and it seems to me that the question that determines whether or not this is a story to journalists, is, are we seeing displacement? We are seeing displacement with the fissured workforce. We are seeing workers who used to work for corporations and be guaranteed a certain level of benefits no longer be guaranteed that level of benefits. Are we seeing the same thing with independent contractors?
There's a lot of questions there. So
that was more than three.
Yeah. So
I could jump in and just tackle a small piece of what's been said in a couple of ways. I haven't checked the markets since I sat down, but this may be not the right day to talk about ESOPs, given recent market turmoil. However, that said, I actually think it's a good idea. And employee stock ownership programs is what we're talking about. Sorry, you shouldn't be so acronymy. Particularly given that what we've seen in the national income is a shift from compensation to capital, and this is one of the real factors driving inequality, to help workers claim some share of productivity through that capital channel is a good idea. However, end of the day, it's the wage that matters most to working families. And then the only thing I'll say about the big question about is this real, is that, look, this is the risk shift that I talked about earlier and that you kind of articulated in your question is really real. It's been going on for a long time. You talked about it yourself. And part of it is this continued arm's length, and in some way, I think what I called the on-demand economy, the fissured economy, in some way is the last blow of the great risk shift, where we don't even have employees anymore. So that downside part of this is definitely real, and it's one of the reasons why these policy solutions are so important. I mean, when Sagan starts talking about people who work in warehouses, boy, do they sound like employees to me.
So maybe David, you could talk a little bit about talk a little question of, is this real? Like, we talked about the sharing economy being a relatively small part of it. There have been independent contractors, whether they're FedEx truck drivers or port workers. Can you talk a little bit about what do the numbers say about which aspect of the contingent workforce is growing?
So first of all, the it in that sentence is really critical. Is what real? And the answer, I believe, Jared has it right, which is that there has been over the last multiple decades a shift in accountability from the employer to the worker. And that continues, and it happens in various ways. I'll just give you one personal example. When I started in Washington many years ago, the federal retirement system was deemed way too rich, and so we modeled. It had a very strong defined benefit plan, and it was incredible. It was a golden handcuff. And so the very first piece of legislation I worked on after the '86 Tax Reform Act was reforming the civil service retirement system, at which point we moved away from a complete defined benefit plan to the traditional three-legged stool that exists today. It is now considered too rich because the rest of the world has moved away from defined benefit plans completely and is saying you may have a defined contribution plan. That is happening in many places. That is the bigger picture. When we talk about the on-demand, the sharing economy, the gig economy, whenever we get our terms right, that is also real. We are, as I said, we're seeing nearly a doubling in 3 to 4 years, and I think it will be much bigger than that going forward. And we need to recognize that it is very attractive to people to have the kinds of options that an Uber driver may have or an Airbnb person may have. They may actually say, I possess an asset that I can actually get some money out of, and it's easy to do. How do I do that in a way that in the plethora of rules that I have to follow? And so I actually believe both the phenomena are real. Is it a crisis? Perhaps not, but I think it will become one, and I think Senator Warner has even more energy around this than I do. So, so I'm leaning forward, so I didn't want to cut him off.
No. Go.
I want to talk about the knowledge economy question because we've been spending a lot of time talking about low-wage workers, but the truth is that the atomization of work is going to happen across all sectors with lawyers, doctors. There are already doctors that you can call on demand and services built up around doctors who want to work more, flexibly. I'm a fellow at Institute for the Future, and one of my colleagues there, named Devin Fiddler, wrote about his experience building an algorithm of a firm in the Harvard Business Review. Basically, they wanted to recreate what a firm did just using an algorithm. And so took a few hours to plug in parameters in the flow of tasks. And it asked first for Amazon's Mechanical Turk workers to pull articles and then dedupe them. And then the algorithm went to Odesk and found technical analysts who extracted and arranged the key insights. And then it went back to Elance for a cohort of writers who then took that and put it into something coherent. And then back to Odesk for some editors who pulled it together. And for a Fortune 500 company, they delivered a 124-page report with 60 images and graphs, entirely done.
Were there any
by
cat
an
videos
algorithm.
in there?
One cat video at the end to see if you actually read the thing.
Yeah.
So the point I make is that there's a lot of people talking about the future of the firm is just going to look very, very different. And so I think what we're seeing now are signals of where we might be.
Okay.
Let me just, can I
go ahead.
weigh in a couple? I remember a couple of friends, I've been talking about this, and they all sent me the journal article. I said, they're saying, Warner, you may need to be talking about something that's not there. And I read through that, and it just, I know it had some data points, but at one point, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I thought they pared it down to where they said in this kind of on-demand economy, it's roughly 200,000 workers. They had some ridiculously low number that was smaller than even just the Uber workforce number one. So and I know some of these classification issues and definition, it doesn't feel right in any way to me. And I think all from GAO to McKinsey to the other studies show a much bigger universe. And David's comments about whether, again, it's 3, 5, 8, or 10, it is a sizable and it's at the hockey stick.
Which is why you're requesting.
Number one. Number two, I've also seen the data on decline of entrepreneurship. Yet, I look at my work that just got a $10 billion valuation for shared entrepreneurial space that's now popping up all over the country. I think about being a venture capitalist in Virginia. I think about, before I was governor, starting regional venture capital funds and in Southside and Southwest and Shenandoah Valley and elsewhere around Virginia, and having no deal flow. And now in virtually every community around Virginia, there's enormous growth of incubators, entrepreneurial centers, and just from a flow standpoint, I don't know, it seems to me, again, whether it's by choice or economic necessity, a real dramatic rise from even where it was 7 or 8 years ago. I think a lot of this is happening post-recession because people, again, by choice or lack of opportunity may be forced into this. On the question of the knowledge issue, I'm intrigued by the president's proposal on 2 years. It's not going to happen in Congress. I do think something we tried in Virginia, I'd love to do as a starting point, a K-12 and a half, similar to the German European program, so that you guarantee with your high school diploma comes an industry certification. And if you don't finish it in high school, you can finish it up to in that same year you graduated to community college within that same calendar year. So it has a tail on it, and I can even show the most non-financial legislator that it gets payback in less than 3 years. And the final point that I'd make, and I think this again gets into another category about how you get capitalism right. And I said, as a government, I worry that our government-driven training programs oftentimes don't train people for the jobs that exist today. That if there's a way that we can engage more the private sector in this, and the notion of training may not be semester-driven anymore, it may be modular, apprenticeship, but it may even be subsets of that, that it's really important not only in terms of getting people for the workforce, but once somebody made the comment earlier about you made the comment about you don't want to fight the move from agriculture to mechanization, but I do have a gut worry with globalization and automation. I know there's always been the next thing, and I don't want to appear like a Luddite, but the more we can make the investment in that, particularly low and moderate worker, a higher value in the value chain so they don't become the first thing that's disposed of versus a piece of equipment or new innovation. It's really important. Right. And the more we can tie that into getting capitalism again to work for everybody, that's another comment.
All right, 3 more questions.
And I used up all my time. I'll give all the rest today.
You yield back your time.
You've been very restrained for a senator.
Hey, I used to be a governor and a business guy. So.
That's why you're the optimist here.
My name is Mark Materno. I'm a fellow at Interactivity Foundation. We did a project a couple of years ago on the future of employment, and I'm happy to see that we talked about a lot of the things that you're talking about here, but I want to mention a couple of things, concerns that my panelists had that we haven't mentioned, a couple of concerns, and then I want to tell a little anecdote. One concern that drove a good deal of our discussion was the concern that in the future, private sector just is not going to be able to produce or create as many jobs as they had in the past, and that was not a result of the failure of the economy, but a result of the success, that employers are there really not to employ people. That's not their job. Their job is to make products, make services, make money. And we're just doing it more efficiently, better with fewer people. And that was going to increase as the technology increases. Big fear was what happens when the driverless cars come out. I mean, just think about the Ubers and the taxi drivers and the truck drivers and so on and so forth. So that was one concern. At the same time, there was a concern that there's a growing gap in the workforce, almost like a barbell thing, between workers who were highly motivated, highly talented, skilled, educated, and those who were not motivated, unskilled. And this was not a distinction between those who went to college and those who didn't. It was, for better or for worse, something having to do with work ethic, though we couldn't say that word because there were people who thought that it might offend somebody. So you had those two phenomena going on at the same time. And
so I'm sorry, what's the question?
I'm just telling two
But what's the
concerns.
two concerns you want to address?
And then I just want to tell an anecdote.
Actually,
Because
if we
while
could
this
just
was.
keep it short, because
I'm trying to keep it short. While this was going on, I had a panelist who was a vice president of, executive vice president of one of the public colleges in Virginia. And he was telling me, well, they're meeting every day because they have to decide who counts as a full-time employee among teachers, because
okay,
teachers
I'm sorry, but we've got.
If I could just finish with the point. The reason why they wanted to do this was to determine who was a full-time employee so that they wouldn't be after Obamacare came in.
All right, so a couple other questions, brief, please.
Yeah, aren't we talking about two separate things? The college-educated millennial who wants to work at WeWork and have 3 different jobs, Airbnb, whatever, and then the lower, unskilled worker who's the truck driver, who's doing it because he has no choice. And shouldn't the policy considerations address that?
Okay, great. Oh, one more question, maybe over on the side. Sorry.
Hi, Jessica Sheeter. I'm a fiscal policy analyst at the Center for Effective Government. As a young millennial, I just wanted to kind of talk about this push and pull between innovation and being the ability to monetize your time, basically. And at the end of the day, we do only have 24 hours, and on the ground, this ability to be an innovator and to be entrepreneurial. There's also a tension there for people who are my age and very highly educated, but wind up juggling 4 or 5 jobs. The ability to monetize your time actually, in some ways, decreases your ability to invest energy in longer term projects, in starting your own business and continuing your education. So there is a push and pull there, and I mean ultimately, it's not to be forgotten the benefits of employers kind of subcontracting winds up being, reducing labor costs. And ultimately, how are we to make those longer term investments? If we can monetize all of our time, if it's $2 per hour, we're still not going to have enough to live off of. So just kind of talking about that contrast.
Go ahead.
Just to say, and building on a couple of comments, I worry a lot about the truck driver in California who's driving daily, working for somebody, and not classified as an employee. I worry about him, I worry about his family, and I want him and others to get together, organize, get the plan from Jared and go fight the good fight. I also worry, though, about what's going to happen when that truck doesn't need a driver. I worry about the day laborer in New Orleans who is standing outside a street corner after Hurricane Katrina made the city the world's largest construction site. I worry about that day laborer and his or her rights. I also worry about when platforms collapse labor markets and the whole world is a labor market that you can access whether you're a worker or a consumer. I worry about the fact that long-term unemployment and surplus labor are going to be more than they are now drivers of the period of time we spend unemployed. And the question there is what you do about that in the future. The answer, I think, is all roads do lead to some kind of guaranteed or universal basic income. There is now conversation going on about this in a surprising spread of places, and it could be an issue that if we treat it right, there's an uncommon alliance to be built across an uncommon set of allies.
Can I say a couple just quickly? First of all, that's I think the third time you've talked about universal basic income, and I've avoided saying anything about it, but I think it's really interesting. And I read this book
just the third time today.
Yeah, today.
But you did giggle. You did giggle.
Well, I just read this book by Peter Barnes about that. Peter's coming to talk to us about it at the Center on Budget, and I commend his book. It seems like a very far-out idea to me, but I respect you even more than I did after the panel than I did before, so it makes me want to learn more about this. But I will say one thing about this. Look, we have a basic demand problem in our economy, and we're not creating enough jobs, and a number of people have kind of alluded to this. And interestingly, we have a Federal Reserve that wants to raise rates to slow the economy down, just to be slightly topical. So there's some confusion among macroeconomists about what we should even be doing right now to increase the demand and close the output gaps we have that are very much alive and well. And I think one great idea in this space is more infrastructure investment. And if Congress were able to do, if people like Senator Warner were able to do that, I suspect we'd see more of that. I will say one thing. It is very hard to make a case.
Said three things, actually.
Oh, okay. It's very hard to make a case that we are doing more efficient production with fewer people. Because if that were true, we'd see productivity increasing, and instead productivity is growing along the source.
Right. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to your question about whether there's different policy prescriptions for the low wage versus the knowledge worker, but we've got to close out, so.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're at time. Thank you all so much for contributing to this conversation. It was really terrific, and please join me in thanking our panel. And please do come back for future events in our Working in America series. Thank you.